Thank you, Professor Tamer, for kindly inviting me to this conference. It's an honor to be a part of such a distinguished panel of speakers. So I'll be talking about the concept of life in Islam. But before I begin my actual presentation, I just thought about saying a few general words about life, especially in this very difficult, very challenging times. So we have this pandemic, which has claimed already over 1 million lives all over the world, and still people are suffering. And it has been such a life-altering experience on so many different fronts for so many people. So one is left wondering: does life has any meaning in this, especially in this kind of situation? So so let's see what perspectives we can gain from the Islamic tradition. So I'll be using slides. So let me put my slides on the screen right now. So I hope you all can see. So my presentation has actually 7 parts. So I'll begin with the question of how to study the concept of life in Islam. Since this is a kind of general, it's a vast topic, but I'll try to speak in a general way so that non-specialist, so that a non-specialist audience can also kind of understand what's going on about the concept of life in the Islamic tradition. And so after that, I'll briefly discuss some of the basic senses of life, and then talk about how life is discussed in the Quran. And then I'll move on to discuss various forms of life in the Islamic tradition, such as cultural, political, philosophical, and mystical life. And then finally, I will conclude. All right, so how to study the concept of life in Islam? Since, as I mentioned, it's such a vast topic and so many things come to mind. So let me clarify at the very beginning something about my scholarship and my kind of approach to studying intellectual history in Islam. So my approach is kind of philological and historical, but at the same time, I do make use of some theory from time to time. But for this presentation, I feel like I'm talking to a general audience. So I'll rather use kind of simplified, heuristic to make sense of things, which should be taken kind of cautiously. So for this presentation, I thought about 2 primary approaches to the idea of life in Islam. So on my left is what I call the Ash'ari Salafi Islamist approach to life, represented by this 20th century Indian subcontinental thinker called Maududi. And then on my left is the other approach, which I call the intellectual, aesthetic, and inward-oriented approach, represented by Syed Hussein Nasr, who is originally from Iran and currently resides in the US. So this is a matter of heuristic, as I said. It does not capture the complexity of life in all of the Islamic tradition, but it will nonetheless be helpful to keep in mind these 2 approaches as we move forward. So the Ash'ari Salafi Islamist approach focuses on the divine will. So in this approach, as Maududi says in his Nizam al-Hayat fil Islam, that when it comes to understanding how one should live their life, one has to accept the Sharia, one has to accept what's in Revelation, the Islamic revelation, and one has to follow the divine will. And life also in this context is holistic. It embraces all dimensions of life, political, social, etc. But there is an emphasis on the communal and political dimensions in this approach. So when it comes to the other approach, as in contrast to an emphasis on the divine will, it focuses on the divine intellect and divine love. Not that it denies the function of the will, it also accepts revelation, but there is a focus on the intellect and love. But it's also like the approach on the left, holistic, And then in contrast to the approach on the left, it emphasizes the spiritual and intellectual dimensions, but it does not also deny these other dimensions. It's important to note this holistic idea of life because there is no kind of public and private life as we understand today in the West, in Islam, especially in these approaches. That does not mean all Muslims kind of you follow exactly the Salafi or the intellect. Of course, there are Muslims who may be secular in their approach. So that's also something to take into consideration. But in general, the life is understood kind of more holistically. All right, I should also make clear that I'm just approaching this as a critical scholar, so I'm not going to either support or endorse any of these approaches. It's just, as I said, as a matter of heuristic, so that we understand what's going on. Because there seems to be so much controversy about all of this, one needs to kind of emphasize that, it's kind of multidimensional. It's not just a matter of this approach and that approach. It's because it's such a vast tradition. All right, so how do we understand the basic senses of life in Islam? What are some of the key words and so forth? So when we consult the dictionaries, I mean Arabic dictionaries, they tell us that life is kind of the meaning of life, concept of life. Hayat is kind of self-evident, especially it's understood through its opposite, which is death. But there are also more technical definitions. So as we consult more philosophical definitions, I call them biophilosophical definitions. So here are some representative examples. So this is from the Islamic philosopher Al-Kindi, who describes life as follows, or who defines life as follows. Life is the principle that animates the body and makes it a living body. The soul is the essence of life in the body. And then another related definition, and this is from the famous, perhaps the most influential of all Islamic philosophers, that is Avicenna, and he defines soul, in which the understanding of life is implicated, as follows. The soul, or nafs, is the first perfection of a natural body possessed of organs that performs the activities of life. So as you can see, the words such soul, nafs, or life, and life, hayat, are intertwined. In fact, one of the lexical meanings of the word nafs is life, and this is also found in the Quran in the following verse, man qatala nafsan bighayri nafsin. Whoever kills a life unless it be for another life. But here, nafs is understood as life. So it's important to note before we go further and look at other meanings that life is here is kind of holistic in the sense that it involves not just the chemical components of a system, but also kind of soul, which is to say consciousness, and so forth. Also, in the Avicennan definition, you might notice the word used for perfection is is in Arabic kamal, and in the Greek word is entelekia, which has a slightly different translation. But this is not without significance. I'll not get into the details of that right now, but it's important to understand that when we think of life in the Islamic tradition, it's kind of very different from some of the modern understanding, especially scientific understandings of life. For example, life is defined by NASA as a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. And then there are other definitions of life that that kind of focuses on its chemical properties, or that defines life as something and self-auto-generated system, and there are so-called autopoietic definitions of life, and then there are genetic, even thermodynamic conceptions of life, again focusing on kind of just biochemical properties of the body and so forth, and how the body works and so forth. But in this conception, the body is important, as you can see from these definitions, but also soul or consciousness is part of the definition of life. All right. To explain further how life is understood holistically, let's look at some of the more mystical slash philosophical definitions of life. So this is from a Sufi thinker, Shah Wali Allah, from the 18th century India. And he is explaining the word nafs, which has many different meanings. But one of the meanings, as I explained earlier, has to do with life. So he says, for example, in his Al-Taf Al-Quds, sometimes the word nafs is used to mean the principle of life, mabda'i hayat. In this sense, it's synonymous with ruh. Ruh is sometimes used, sometimes it means the spirit, sometimes the soul. And then he further explains, by ruh is meant that which, when it is associated with the body, jasad, is the source of the latter's life, while when divorced from it, it is the cause of its death. Also, life in its adjectival form is also one of the names and attributes of God in Sufi theology, al-Hayy, and as such plays a notable role in Sufi thought. In Sufi thought, it's understood to be the manifestation of the self or soul and its illumination through divine light. And then in theology, life is understood as a kind of accident or an attribute that causes one to be qualified by knowing, willing, etc. So as I said, there's a plethora of different senses. There are different meanings of life in Islam, and they are to be distinguished from more contemporary understandings, which only focus on the chemical or let's say the genetic dimensions of life. All right, so moving on to the next section. How does the Quran talk about life? This is going to be actually very interesting. So when the word hayat occurs in the Quran actually quite frequently, over 100 times, and its cognates also occur many times. So the Quran talks about the life of the world, hayat ad-dunya, and then the hereafter, al-akhirah. So let's look at some of these verses to understand the contrast between life of the world versus the hereafter. So for example, this verse. So chapter 42 of the Quran, verse 20, it says, whoso desireth the harvest of the hereafter, we give him increase in its harvest. And whoso desireth the harvest of the world, we give him thereof, and he hath no portion in the hereafter. And then another verse, know that the life of this world is only play, an idle talk, a spectacle, and boasting to one another, and so forth. And rivalry in respect to wealth and children. And in the hereafter, there is grievous punishment, but also forgiveness from God and His good pleasure, whereas life of the world is by matter of illusion. And this is actually one of the frequent refrains in the Quran. This occurs in so many places. Life of the world is by matter of illusion. And then another verse, kind of repeating the same theme. Beautified for people, Zuina linnas, is love of the joys that come from women and sons, and stored up heaps of gold and silver, and horses branded with their mark, and cattle and land. That is the comfort of the world. God with him is a more excellent abode. So when you look at these verses, and there are many similar verses, it's very clear life of the world is something to be shunned, it's kind of harshly criticized, right? And life of the hereafter, that is when people die and go to the next stage, that is the life to be preferred over this life. But here's the twist. Just as the Quran talks about the life of the world in negative terms, the Quran also has this idea of the good life. So, or hayat tayyiba. So what is the good life? So here's this verse. Whosoever doeth right, whether male or female, and is a believer, we shall surely cause them to live a good life, and we shall pay them a recompense in proportion to the best of what they used to do. So what is the good life? So first of all, according to this verse, the good life applies to both men and women. According to this verse, men and women are of the same moral and spiritual stature. That is, they share the same responsibility and they have the same capability for independent moral choice and the same recompense for their deeds. And then when you look at the classical tafsir tradition, Quranic commentary tradition, according to such well-known exegetes such as Al-Tustari, Al-Qurtubi, Al-Razi, the good life refers to the various ways in which belief and virtue make one's life, even in this world, satisfying and peaceful. For example, the good life is said to be characterized by the sweetness of obedience, turning over to God the management of one's affairs and one's breast, and having one's breast, expanded by knowledge of God. To explain further, that is, the good life is that in which believers become more and more aware of the transient nature of worldly things, and they're said to be less distressed by the kind of ups and downs of earthly life, because they enjoy a spirit of certitude, they leave matters in God's hand, they resign to God's will, and so forth, and kind of have this mentality of accepting whatever God kind of whatever trials they're put into. And they try to seek serenity and peace inwardly through divine obedience. So on the one hand, there's the idea of life of the world being kind of very full of enjoyment, full of negative emotions, full of trials and so forth, or full of pleasures which are to be shunned and so forth. On the other hand, the Quran also talks about the good life. And alongside the idea of the good life, there's this idea of goodness, virtue, beauty. So it's so interesting. The word husn in Arabic has all these different meanings. So the Quran also talks about how there can be both goodness in this life and the hereafter. So there's this verse, for example, which says, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, and forget not your portion in this world. Or this one, our Lord, given to us in the world that which is good, and in the hereafter that which is good, and guard us from the doom of fire. And similar verses are found in other places as well. And then when you look at the Hadith tradition, there's this very interesting story. But before I narrate the story, there's this prayer which occurs in many different places. So there's this prayer by the Prophet which says, "O Allah, set right for me the affairs of the world wherein is my living. Decree the hereafter to be good for me, and make this life for me a source of abundance for every good." And then there's this hadith from the Bukhari. So it's talking about a story where one day the Prophet was sitting with his companions, and he was saying, what I'm most afraid of you is the fact that sometimes even the blessings of this world can be a source of great distress for you. And then upon hearing this, a man asked this question: how is it that something which is a blessing, which is good, can bring forth something evil? Can something good, in other words, can something good bring forth something that is evil? So hearing this, the Prophet remained silent for a while until it appeared as though he was being inspired. And then he has, where's the questioner? And then someone pointed to that person. And then he says to the man, good never brings forth but good. In other words, confirming what the speaker has, I'm confirming his intuition that la ya'til khayr illa bil khayr. So if there are blessings in this world, they're to be seen as blessings. But the Prophet also adds by saying that imagine those blessings to be like a good harvest, if one makes use of or something like a harvest or something like a source of wealth, and if one is kind of if one spends this wealth rather judiciously, then one is kind of saved. One is able to take care of his affairs or her affairs. One is able to take care of one's affairs well. But if one is kind of greedy and so forth, then this goodness, then this wealth, which is the source of goodness, can be the source of one's happiness in some way, can also be a source of great calamity and so forth. All right, so added to this is the fact that there are many empirical studies conducted in different parts of the world that show that when Muslim students were asked about about life, about what they understand to be the meaning of life, they point out that for them life's meaning derives from both spiritual and material factors. So for a Muslim student, life's meaning reflects a holistic and comprehensive phenomenon, as both religious and worldly elements tend to be linked in one form or the other. Now the question is, I hope we're not getting confused because maybe I'm saying too many things at the same time. But I started out with this slide where I read these verses, and they painted a very negative view of life of the world, and they were kind of categorical in their preference for the hereafter. But then I talked about the good life, and then I talked about how these prayers from the Quran and the Prophet show that one should seek good both from this life and the hereafter. So there seems to be a contradiction. How can life of the world be, on the one hand, full of distresses, full of trials, on the other hand, a source of goodness? In other words, how does one reconcile to these two opposing perspectives? Can life of the world be both good and evil? So the Quran does not categorically answer this question. It has that negative view of the life of the world. Dunya can simply be here below. But on the other hand, there are those verses that does say, well, life in this world can also be good and so forth. But overall, it seems to be, at least as far as I'm concerned, that there is definitely a preference for the next life. So, for example, this verse says, "Inna darul akhirah lahiyal hayawan." Surely, the abode of the hereafter, that is the real life, and you can't miss the kind of quote unquote Platonic connotations of this verse, along with many other similar verses, where all right, life of the world, you can it's not, you don't have to completely shun deny various blessings that one can find in this life, but at the same time, there is a greater good in the abode of the hereafter. All right, that seems to be the kind of, in a nutshell, the Quranic view of life. Now, let's move on to discuss other forms of life in Islam. So in this section, I'll briefly touch on the cultural and political life. So imagine we go to a medieval Muslim city, and the question that can be asked then is what would we observe? So if we want to understand life within Islamic civilization, it's necessary to understand the diverse ethnic and cultural worlds into which the Islamic revelation descended and which Islam transformed and made its own. So it's very important that we understand how different foreign elements were introduced into the Islamic world from the vast heritage of for example, the ancient Mediterranean civilizations, Persia, and later India, China, Africa, and in the Malay world, and beyond. So life, and when it comes to kind of cultural, political life, there's a remarkable kind of variety and diversity and that one sees in various Islamic lands. And one can say this is not just true of the medieval world, but also even of the modern world. But there are some of these there are some of these phenomena that are kind of broadly speaking found in more or less all over the Islamic world. So the role of the 5 pillars is one such thing which one observes all over the Islamic world in varying degrees. And then the daily life in the medieval Islamic world revolves around its markets and mosques. These are the 2 main institutions that are kind of the center of everything that goes on in more or less in every major city and town. And then when it comes to civic and public life, one sees, for example, one observes collection and distribution of zakat, management of markets, inspection of weights and measures, and overseeing of the mining of gold and silver. And then organization of the armies, provisioning, the distribution of booty, management of the frontier ribats, management of natural resources, penal law, and the appointment of judges, and so on and so forth. So it's important to note in all of this that, well, just like in our day and age, people do things that we say belong to the secular sphere. There is also that domain, although not necessarily called the secular, but when you're talking about these things, they're not kind of like on a par with something like the 5 pillars of Islam, like prayer, fasting, and so forth. So this distinction of sacred, secular kind of is intertwined. It simply did not exist, and it still does not exist in many parts of the Islamic world. And also, it also challenges our modern versus pre-modern divide, and that's a different topic I'm going to. But if by modernity, if we understand kind of a propensity to make things efficient and so on and so forth, then we do see in various parts of this in Islamic history how there were attempts to make various institutions better, more efficient, workable, and so forth. So one can think about the transition from the institution of caliphate, from the sultanate, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so that's about cultural and political life. Now let's move on to discuss philosophical life. So this is going to be so interesting because there's so much controversy in the mind. So a lot of people, when it comes to the role of philosophy in Islam, or the way how we talk about philosophers in the tradition, there seems to be so much controversy surrounding them. So I thought of choosing this figure called Zakaria Razi because he seems to be a very controversial figure, called a heretic by many people, including Abu Hatim Razi, who was an Ismaili thinker. Uh, and it was claimed that he kind of denied prophecy and so forth. So unfortunately, these claims are so hard to verify because many of some of his works have been lost. But the ones that are there, do not seem to kind of show those so-called quote unquote heretical elements. On the other hand, on the contrary, here are some of the passages from some of his works. So this is from his Al-Sira Al-Falsafiyya, so the philosophical life. Uh, so let's read this passage. So, quote, now the basic principles on which we base the practical elements of the philosophical life, and which we use here in abridged form, are the following. We have a state after death that is either praiseworthy or blameworthy, depending on the way we lived during the time our souls were with our bodies. The noblest thing for which we were created and to which we are directed is not the pursuit of bodily pleasures, but rather the acquisition of knowledge and the application of justice, both of which lead to our liberation from this world in the world in which there is neither pain nor death. Both nature and whim led us to prefer the pleasure of the present, while the intellect often calls on us to give up present pleasure in favor of things that it prefers. The Lord of us all, from whom we anticipate reward and fear punishment, watches over us, is merciful with us, does not seek to harm us, loathes our injustice and ignorance, and loves our justice and knowledge. Now, this is very interesting. When you contrast this perspective on what is called philosophical life, and think about the Ash'ari, Maududi, Ash'ari Salafi approach represented by the likes of Maududi, it seems like there is a continuity. Razi is not denying the life in the reward and punishment based on what we do in this life, and he is saying that there is a Lord. There, in other words, God will judge us based on what we do here, and that seems to be also something in common with the Ash'ari Salafi approach. But at the same time, he is emphasizing other elements that one does not see in the Salafi Ash'ari approach. For example, the focus on the intellect, and then also focus on justice, knowledge, and so on and so forth, and then kind of understand and focusing on kind of internal pleasures of the soul, and kind of shunning the bodily pleasures, even though that might seem more appealing in the present context when we live our life in this world. So it's more like it just reminds me of Plato's Euthyphro, and divine command versus following one's nature, that sort of thing. So here is Maududi. For him, divine intellect is incapable of figuring out things on its own, or even our our intuitions, our knowledge derived from senses, they're kind of faulty and so forth. So you just rely on the scripture, you just follow God's will, and whatever God asks you, the way you interpret it, that's how you lead your life. On the other hand, here there's as I mentioned, a greater role of the intellect. The intellect, when it focuses on what's good for itself, it comes to certain conclusions. So to unpack this, let's read another passage. Quote, "We say summarily that since the Creator is the knower who is not ignorant, the just who does no wrong, since knowledge, justice, and compassion exist absolutely, since we do have a Creator and Lord, since we are to Him servants to be ruled, and since the servants most beloved of their masters are those who carry out their way of living and pursue their code of behavior, then the servant closest to God, mighty and exalted is He, is the most learned, most just, most compassionate, and merciful." The whole of this statement is what is meant by the philosophers saying philosophy is imitating God. And this is famous saying, which you see over and over again in various philosophical texts, in al-falsafa tashabbuh bil-bari, something like that. So philosophy is imitating God to the degree that humans are capable of, or humans are able, end of quote. So as I said, just like Maududi, Razi, quite surprisingly, because it's called heretic, he's not denying that we're ultimately servants, and one is supposed to follow a code of behavior prescribed to us by God and so forth. But at the same time, one also makes use of one's intelligence and figure out the best way to attain salvation or happiness is to exercise love, compassion, justice, and mercy, and so on and so forth. Now, because there has been, as I said, there is so much controversy around philosophy, the role of philosophy in Islam. I'll just read more texts or try to unpack the idea of the philosophical life in Islam a bit more. So let's look at Avicenna, who kind of takes these things to the next level. So this is from these are some of the quotes and ideas from his famous Isharat, famous book, late work Isharat. So the first quote says continuing what Razi has been saying, quote, "In their present lives, knowers have stations and ranks that are reserved for them to the exclusion of others. It is as if, while being clothed by their bodies, they have shed their bodies, become free from them, and attain the world of saintliness." So Maududi actually is aware, for example, of this distinction between the body and the soul, and he thinks this idea of kind of mind, body, soul dualism is something foreign to Islam, and there's no place of kind of asceticism or denying ordinary life in Islam. But it does seem like that's not exactly what philosophers are saying, although there's a focus on how one should avoid bodily pleasures, and kind of salvage the soul from its bodily entanglements. But it seems to be a bit more complex than a simple kind of body-soul dualism. So Avicenna distinguishes asceticism versus the path of knowledge. So what someone like Maududi might think, oh, this is just asceticism, it's kind of world-denying spirituality, kind of doing things that robs the body of its kind of natural happiness and so forth. Actually, even Razi is very explicit. He even mentions Hindus and yogis and Manichaeans who do things that are kind of very ascetic. So that's not what they're talking about. That's why Avicenna has this distinction between asceticism versus the path of knowledge. So here's what Avicenna says: worship for the ascetic is a business deal. It's as if one acts in the present life for a salary that one hopes to receive in the afterlife. But for the knower, arif, Worship or prayer is an exercise of one's spiritual will. This is a Sufi term, himma, that he uses, including imaginative and aesthetic sensibilities. So this is so interesting. So for the likes of Maududi, the Ash'ari Salafi actually does indeed use this analogy of how when one becomes Muslim, it's as though one signs a contract. When one says, for example, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, one signs a contract. One has a deal with God. One is supposed to follow certain rules and regulations and so forth, in the hope of kind of receiving a kind of salary in the hereafter. And this is also based on some of the verses in the Quran. So that's why it's kind of complicated. It's not one or the other. Just as one would see, one would find a lot of support for the path of knowledge for the Avicenna approach, also in the Quran. One would also see kind of the verses that seem to kind of support the kind of interpretation that that Ash'ari or the Salafis, Ash'aris or the Salafis would prefer. In any case, Avicenna makes it clear that there's a difference between being static and being a knower. But being a knower does not mean one simply one has recourse to kind of theoretical knowledge only. Rather, the knower also needs what he calls riyadha, again, a Sufi term, spiritual exercise or spiritual exercises that is meant to bring about a transformation of one's consciousness. And so one gradually, it's an ascending journey, as I quoted him earlier. The goal is to attain the world of saintliness. All right, so that's the kind of philosophical approach to life. How about other approaches? So here's the mystical approach to life. And again, this is such a vast topic and so interesting. But in a nutshell, these guys are, they seem to be saying, well, life does not make sense without love, without beauty, without intoxication. So this idea of life without intoxication, in fact, you can see the miniature on the left that shows, in a kind of, excuse me, that shows what happens when people are intoxicated and so forth. So this is the life full of intoxication, love, and beauty. And it's captured by this very famous poem, Khamriya, of Ibn al-Faruq. So let me read the poem, and then I'll just say one or two words about the poem. Remembering the beloved, wine we drink, which drunk had made us heir the vine's creation. So the Arabic is actually quite rhyming and beautiful. Sharibna ala dhikr al-habib mudam. Sakirna biha min qabli an yakhluq al-karm. A sun it is, the full moon is its cup. A crescent hands it around. How many stars shine forth from it the moment it be mixed? But for its fragrance, ne'er had I been guided unto its tavern. But for its resplendence, imagining could no image make of it. Time, its mere gasp, hath left, hidden it is, like secrets pent up in the intelligence. Yet, if it be remembered in the tribe, all become drunk, no shame on them, nor sin. He hath not lived here who hath sober lived, and he that dieth not drunk hath missed the mark. فلا عيش في الدنيا لمن عاش صاحيا ومن لم يمت سكرا بها فاته الحزب. With tears then let him mourn himself. على نفسه فليبكي من ضاع عمره وليس له فيها نصيب ولا سهم. With tears then let him mourn himself, whose life had passed and he no share of it had had. Now, this is a very long poem, and it's been commented by many people after Ibn al-Farid. I consulted some of these commentaries, especially the one by Nabulusi from Syria, 18th century, I believe, 17th, 18th century. So every word is full of kind of imagery and rich symbolism. So the wine actually, so the wine symbolizes divine love, also divine knowledge. And then it's talking about how before creation, all souls were submerged in divine love and divine beauty. Sorry, divine love and knowledge. And then, of course, it's talking about one's return to that state, that primordial state, through remembering the beloved. And remember, the word for remembrance is the word dhikr, which has lots of different meanings. It's also the very famous Sufi practice where one utters a sacred formula, one of the names of God, or the supreme name of God. And then the Sufis talk about how through that exercise, one's soul is to be transmuted, so that ultimately one moves from remembering the beloved to become kind of himself or herself, the beloved. Because for them, at the end of the spiritual journey, the dhakir, dhikr, and madhkur are one and the same for many of these Sufis. In any event, these are some of the doctrines, you might say, that are also controversial. But because when they talk about union, there's this common misperception that how the servant human beings kind of unite with the absolute being, which is God and so forth, and how is that possible? There are many Sufis who deny that. So it's not exactly that, but it's also something very subtle, something which is also, as I said, very controversial. But there's supposed to be some kind of return to the primordial state of one's being. All right, so that's the kind of mystical life. It's life full of love, intoxication, and ecstasy. But Sufism, as we know, is vast and is multidimensional. So within Sufism, there are Sufis who take a more kind of sober approach. So here is another version of another approach to life by Imam al-Haddad from 18th century Yemeni Sufi theologian, and he explains life as follows. So life has 5 stages. The first life begins when God created Adam and set in his loins all his descendants, the happy among them and the wretched. The second life begins from the time when a human comes out into the world until the time when she dies and departs from it. The third life is the life of the intermediate realm, or barzakh. The fourth life begins when people emerge from their grave on the day of resurrection. The fifth life begins when people enter the garden eternally, or, depending on their case, the hell, wherein they're to remain either eternally or for a specified period. As a side note, there's a lot of controversy whether hell is eternal or it comes to an end and so forth. Anyway, this is another version of what is life in Islam, and one can think about many other forms as well. But we should try to conclude because I think I'm running out of time. So yeah, I mentioned at the very beginning how when it comes to life in Islam as a general phenomenon, we can think about these 2 approaches. One is the Ash'ari Salafi Islamist approach, and the other is kind of intellectual aesthetic approach. So the former focuses on the more exterior life. So one can also say there's this division between exterior versus interior life, or life of the Sharia versus life of the intellect. So life of the Sharia is emphasized very much by the first approach. where Maududi and the likes of him do not deny spirituality, but for them, spirituality is confined to, again, the 5 pillars: fasting, going on a pilgrimage, and those things. And beyond that, if there are Sufi practices or other spiritual practices, they're again they're not seen in positive light. On the other hand, there is the kind of mystical philosophical approach. Again, there are nuances between these two, but on the whole, they do seem to point to these spiritual exercises, and then the idea of justice, compassion, the ideas of love, compassion, justice coming into play as one thinks of one's life. Um, so one can say that for the likes of Maududi, the Sharia is a complete plan of life, and spirituality and intellectuality are kind of confined to the 5 pillars. So the overall goal is to properly regulate the worldly life. So you focus on, you think about your society, you think about politics, those things. Now, the other approach does not deny these dimensions, as I said a few times, but it seems like the differences lie in their respective focuses. So for the likes of Nasser, there's a distinction between the exterior life and the interior life. The interior life focused on love, beauty, self-cultivation, contemplation, and prayer is necessary for some. So it seems like the likes of Nasser, for the likes of Nasser, all right, there is Sharia, and that is fine, perhaps for the majority, but then, that's simply is not sufficient. There are others, maybe philosophers, maybe there's mystics like, Ibn al-Farid. For them, you need you need a more aesthetic or philosophical approach to life. So you need love, you need beauty, self-cultivation, contemplation, etc. In addition to the usual practices of the Sharia. And this is because the interior life leads humans from the world of outwardness and separation to that of union and interiority, according to this perspective, becoming ultimately united with the center of the heart and the rhythm which determines human life itself. Thank you.